Welcome to our biology lessons. In this series of biology videos, we will be looking at the ecosystem. Our starting point will be relationships of organisms with one another and with their environment. In this consideration, we will look at energy flow, food chains, and food webs. Under energy flow, you will need to understand the flow of energy through the ecosystem. You will also be expected to describe how energy flows through the ecosystem as heat and light, and how it flows through organisms, and how it is eventually transferred to the environment. The main source of energy for any ecosystem is sunlight, which comes from the sun. The light energy is picked up by producers. A producer is defined as an organism that makes its own organic nutrients, usually by using energy from sunlight through photosynthesis. A consumer is defined as an organism that gets its energy by feeding on another organism. These organisms are related through a series of flow of energy, creating what we call a food chain. A food chain is defined as a series of organisms which are interconnected through a flow of energy, starting with the producers, then the herbivores, and then eventually the carnivores. A herbivore is defined as an organism that gets its energy by eating plants. A carnivore is defined as an organism that eats other organisms, normally animals. In this series, you will be expected to learn how to construct a food chain or a food web. A food chain is defined as a simple fitting relationship which represents the flow of energy. We have illustrated for you simple food chains. In our food chain, we start with the grass. Grass gets its energy in the form of sunlight from the sun. The grass is in turn eaten by a primary consumer, which in this case is a grasshopper. The grasshopper is in turn eaten by a frog, which represents a secondary consumer. The frog is then in turn eaten by a python, which is a tertiary consumer. In our second example of a food chain, we have sunlight energy coming from the sun, being taken by the grass, which is a producer, being taken by a grasshopper, which is a primary consumer, being taken by a shrew, which is a secondary consumer, ending up in the owl, which is a tertiary consumer. This represents simple food chains which we can relate to. A food web, similar to a food chain, but differs in that it's made up of interconnected food chains. What creates a food web is when at least two organisms rely on one organism for energy. That creates a food web. Some food webs are very complex, and therefore you have got many interconnected food chains creating a food web. We will be expected to know that food chains and food webs eventually end up with the decomposers. We define a decomposer as an organism that gets its energy by feeding on dead decaying organisms or dead decaying organic matter. There are two basic organisms which are regarded as decomposers. These are bacteria and fungi. All these organisms which we have been related to discussing, that is the producers, primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary or even quaternary consumers, they are on different levels of feeding called a trophic level. A trophic level is the position which an organism occupies in a food chain or in a food web. This eventually creates what we would call a pyramid of numbers or a pyramid of biomass. So on the lower level of any pyramid, there will be the producers. On the top level, we'll have the primary consumers, then secondary and tertiary consumers. Eventually, the quaternary consumers. Each of these levels represent a trophic level. So as you go up the pyramid of numbers or pyramid of biomass, the numbers of organisms or the amount of biomass decreases. Biomass basically represents biological mass. What that means is that all the organisms on that trophic level, they are collected and they are weighed and their mass is determined. So we expect the producers to have the largest biomass, followed by the primary consumers, the secondary consumers, and the tertiary consumers. So it means as you move up along the trophic levels, the amount of biomass decreases. Each of us as candidates were expected to interpret the pyramids of numbers, pyramids of biomass, and eventually pyramids of energy. This will be the end of this lesson. In our next lesson, we'll be looking at cycling of nutrients in the ecosystem.